Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your host today, and I'm here with the author of a really fantastic new middle grade graphic novel. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Yeah, my name is Zach Weinersmith. I wrote a book called Beowulf, which is a sort of kids adaptation of Beowulf.
It's so much fun, and I'm so glad we get to talk about it today. But I was wondering if we could start with a kind of wider question about your work in comics. You are a very accomplished webcomic creator in addition to these print comics and graphic novels you've done. And I'm wondering, how was working in webcomics different from doing something like this? And on the other hand, was there anything from like your webcomics past that you took into working on these like full-length graphic novels?
Sure. It's very different, I would say, for two reasons. One of which is one of the bad things about doing webcomics is there's this instant gratification aspect. I think you're probably a little too close to your audience, for too close for art's sake. But it's a good learning environment, but maybe not great for developing positive habits. Whereas a graphic novel, a short graphic novel is still 200 pages, and so it takes a lot of your whole career is spent on a single book, and worse, you finish it and then you wait while all the wheels turn, and so it's kind of it's sort of more gratifying in a way, but it's also more nerve-wracking because you're just it's all out there at once. Like if I put out a joke that nobody likes, tomorrow something else goes up. Whereas this is kind of like you just wait to see what people think of this thing you worked on for years. But it's also this is the other big difference is although this is changing, but webcomics, at least when I got into it, was very like it was all small business, self-published stuff, and whereas this is traditional publishing, which has its own kind of differences. There's a lot more editorial stuff and a lot, just sort of a lot more process to it, which is good and bad. Mostly good, I would actually say, although complicated. But yeah, different, but good.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Two of the things you said. So one, the closeness to the audience in webcomics, that's a super interesting point. And it is really weird, I think, to be working on something ongoing and have people reacting to it as you're working on it. Like it really changes the creative process as opposed to like working on something in isolation and then getting the reactions. And in terms of process, like you were talking about, would you say that there are also more voices involved when you're working with the press like this, as opposed to sort of the creative control that you have over webcomics? Or
to an extent, I mean, I don't, there's this tendency to like, I think, especially in the early days of webcomics, there was a kind of like anti any sort of order to anything view, but the truth is, I think you're doing like even if you're self-publishing, if you can, you ought to hire like a copy editor and an editor because like it is very easy to get in your own head too much. There's a kind of balance to be sought. At least in my experience with traditional publishing, with this book, actually, there was a very light hand from the editor. I mean, it was my two different editors. My main editor was Callista Brill, and then Alex Liu came in later in the process. But Callista, I know from earlier projects, we're kind of friends, and so I actually think there are a couple of big places where she suggested changes that I think really improved the book. So it's kind of valuable to have a person who is like cares about the book a lot, not just because they picked it up, but also because like their career is like on the same boat as yours now. Yeah, there are more voices, but it's not like a movie where there are a lot of voices that can like ruin something. Like more voices that are thoughtful, I would say.
So just more collaborative, kind of generally, I guess, right?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I could be a little biased because I'm in the weird position of being a guy who got into traditional publishing late in his career, so I'm a kind of established quantity. So it's possible I have a little more say over my thing than you would if you were like 22 and really needed the deal.
Oh, interesting. So let's move on to the middle grade comics that you've worked on. This is not your first middle grade work inspired by medieval literature.
That's
You also
true.
did Augie and the Green Knight, which is also so much fun and such a great adaptation. And I'm wondering what drew you to medieval literature as a source for this kind of storytelling?
I have this reputation as a science guy, and I actually do have a popular science book coming out this winter. But I have a literature degree. I'm a it's a different type of nerd, you know. And but the my view of it is, I like modern literature. I'm not a kind of knee-jerk old books snob. My wife might disagree about that, but like there is this kind of trove of these wonderful old stories that you know, it, I mean, Beowulf is a little different because there is a real market for Beowulf. Like a lot of people, for whatever reason, that particular medieval story has 80. I think I read in a book there's like 2 adaptations per year, or not 2 adaptations, sorry, 2 translations per year.
Wow.
But yeah, right, and that's like a modern phenomenon. This manuscript has been around for almost 1,000 years, but the popularity I think is post Tolkien and then really post Haney, Seamus Haney. But there are like Gawain and the Green Knight. I know there was a movie. I haven't seen it, but that one's a little more obscure. And then if you get below that, it gets really weird. Like I actually there's an element in Beowulf I actually took from a different story, which is now a very offensive story, appropriately, but it's oh gosh, I'm blanking on that. Constantine, which is the story about like this guy who goes, Constantine goes into battle and he has a vision of the true cross, and then he goes seeking it, and it's this beautiful story, except it's extremely anti-Semitic toward the end. And I'm Jewish, so I feel comfortable talking about this. But like, it is a little like, well, why couldn't he fight a dragon or something? But
Yeah.
but you know, uh, we have a lot of distance on it, and the poetry is just genuinely beautiful. And so my view of it is, when you have this sort of problematical material, the thing to do is to steal the good stuff. Um,
Hmm.
Out of it. But so yeah, there are all these old wonderful medieval stories, and they're actually good. They're not like teacher wagging her finger or his finger at you good. They're like actually good. These were things people sat around telling to each other. Some of it is a little inscrutable, but a lot of it's just astonishingly amazing. I mean, as you know, like Gawain and the Green Knight is that way. It's this like incredibly weird, compelling, sort of uncanny story, and it's hard to make sense of it, but that's kind of part of the fun, similar to Beowulf.
That's such a good point. And I think that like the public view of medieval literature is that it must be like very dry and very
Right.
puritanical, for lack of a better word, even though that's anachronistic. But like it's actually super weird, as you say. Like a lot of it's very surreal. A lot of it is very
Mm-hmm.
like almost like laughably bizarre. There's like a lot of
Yeah.
very strange stuff in there. And I think that probably appeals to kids a lot. Like that's sort of like dream logic and the general
Right.
weirdness that runs through it. Um, the Green Knight in particular is so good. Because it's a great main character. And I think that Gawain probably translates to sort of like kid morality pretty well. Like
Yeah.
what made you want to, tell that story for children?
Uh, I think what I like about that story in particular, there's a couple elements that are neat in that story, which is one, as you say, there's this kind of dream quality where like this weird figure shows up and just is like, go ahead and cut off my head, and everybody's scared to do it, and there's these kind of like, as you say, I mean, it's like, my view is if you want to read really boring literature, go to like the 17th century. Then you're being made to like read the Fairy Queen and this like, what the heck is going on type of stuff. But like these old stories, like they're weird, but they're weird in a like kind of funny way, and the characters can be kind of goofy. And so
Mhm.
it is this weird, like, there's this giant, he's like wants to cut off someone's head, and he says, somebody go first and cut off mine, which is this like, it's like the setup to a joke. But then when he does it, the guy actually cuts off his head, and the giant is like, all right, see you in a year. That's such a wonderful setup to a story. It's like, how is this going to work out? And then the way it does work out is actually very, sort of suspenseful and interesting, and in a way kind of poignant, because it has to do with these sort of like, what kind of a man are you aspect, which is, and as you say, the kind of kid morality aspect, there's this kind of like, I'm doing it because there's a rule. I said I would do it, so I have to do it even if it's crazy.
Yes.
Um, and yeah, so it's just like, like last night, if you want a boring story, read the 17th century, read these horrible court poets, but like, I mean, I like them too, but like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like medieval stuff is very wet. It's very, I was just reading, Slaber's Beowulf is like the definitive, like, you know, grad students have to read it, Beowulf book, and they're talking about, sources for Beowulf, and we don't know what they are, but there are a lot of guesses. And one of the Celtic sources maybe is there's this old genre of stories where people are like in a house doing stuff and a giant hand comes in. And I feel like as you're an adult, you're like, what do you mean a hand? But to a kid, that's like, yeah, that's terrifying. There's just a giant hand. A kid will not be like, why was there a giant hand? They're like, oh my God, how do we deal with the giant hand?
Yes. Yep. That's such a good point. And it does to me, that points out like a straight line between medieval literature and like Monty Python, like, yeah, like that bizarreness was always there. And something I think that these books do so well is like draw the sort of like parallels between like warrior culture and kid culture, because I was thinking as you were talking that like in both those cultures, like promises are super important and like sacrosanct.
I was just talking to someone about this, like, so there are like a lot of attempts to kind of make Beowulf into a cool modern story, and I always feel like it just kind of doesn't work, and in part because of what you're talking about, which is like, so if you remember the opening of Beowulf, it's about these spear Danes and this guy named Shield Shaving, and they just kind of go around basically beating people up and taking their stuff. And as a modern person, you're waiting for the kind of like, this was bad of them, right? And no, it's like, no, it was great. And then, but then at the same time, there's this other element, which is like, you can go around beating up people and taking their stuff, but you have got to share it. Like there are stories within the story that are all about like the bad guy who didn't share. And so it's like a modern morality is much more universalized, which I think is good. I'm not opposed to that, but like this warrior morality is a little more like, like I think the modern moral sense is more like do good to everybody if you can, as opposed to do good to friends, do bad to enemies. But this old warrior view is do bad to enemies is a big part of it. And I think for a kid, that's a big thing. This kind of like, we have people who are against us and we have to stop them. But I am very concerned with whether we're all sharing. It's a very kid way to feel about the world. And so it just maps very nicely to kid life. I mean, I didn't go nuts. I like the kids in this story are not bullies. I didn't feel like I could go there. I didn't want to, but there is this kind of similarity there.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the beginning of the book. And something that I would love to talk about is the language. Because first off, like the first page is like a translation of the first word, of Beowulf.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
And like, because Beowulf starts with Hwit, which I've been studying this for years and I still don't know if I said it right. And you translate it as "Hey, wait," which is such a great kid phrase and also just a great way to start a story. And like, what was your, like, as you were working on this story, like, what was your relationship to the original text? Like, are there moments where like that you were doing direct kind of translation, or was it looser in places? Or
it's what I tried to do. So I did, I have like a collection of translations, and I'm trying to basically go line by line, but I don't translate or anything like that. I was trying to do like what is trying to figure out the sense of why something happens in the story and then convert it to this kid thing. So like the opening, you're right, it is basically the same opening. The opening of Beowulf is basically there's this orphan, and he sort of starts a lineage of chiefs, and it culminates in the death of that orphan in old age, and he has a sort of glorious burial, and then you get this kind of lineage, and it's all good kings. It's another like anti-modern thing. In the modern story, you're expecting the bad king to come along, but there is no bad king. This is just the kind of glorious, lineage. But you can't really do that with kids because kids don't have kids, right? So but what my view is, what it was essentially doing is, so you ask yourself, what is this scene doing? And it's basically just kind of like, setting up, there were these great people in this great place, and I felt like I had to do a little something extra, because if it's like the 7th century or whatever, and someone is telling you Beowulf, you're kind of familiar. Well, we don't know that, but you're probably kind of familiar with like sort of how primogeniture works and that kind of thing. But my setting is new, so I had to kind of like establish a mood and a sort of tone. So like it is telling that story, but instead it's kind of like here are some kids who were really great kids in the past. And the point is that like it's like, so the opening of Beowulf, like it's a culture hero story. So it's like, here are some great people. Why were they great? Because they followed our culture. And so it's doing that. So what the kids do is they basically get away with stuff. They whine until they get their way, and they mess things up, and they don't help clean, and they just do sort of glorious kids things, you know. And so that's what I mean. It's not a translation or anything like that, but it's a kind of sense adaptation of what that scene was trying to do.
Nice. That's a really cool way of putting it, a sense adaptation. Yeah, because it does hit the mood and like the mise en scène, I guess, of like that opening scene.
Mm-hmm.
It sets up the society. And it really does speak to actually like how, you know, warrior lords like established power. Like they just like got a lot of gold and then they distributed it to people, and then those people followed them, you know, and that's like
yeah, no, it is. I was just trying to say about there's this story within the story which I think must have been important because it's told I think at least twice, which is this bad king named Hermod. And literally at one point when it's describing like his badness, says he had like bracelets and he would not share them. You know, I mean, it's like it's very maps very nicely to kids. I mean, but that's like the point. Is like it's I mean, you know, this is something like gang culture. It's just a sort of you know, you follow the guy who's powerful, but he has obligations too, and when he doesn't meet them, bad things happen.
Yes. Oh God, I love it. It's so great. So one of the things that I love too is like what, you know, because we haven't talked about like the monsters yet or the antagonists. Yeah. And I think it ties into like, you know, as you were telling the story of this orphan king and like, you know, like death for him, like his sort of like passing from the kingship is becoming a teenager, you know, like growing up and like not being a kid anymore. And in a way, like the monster of this book is like adulthoods, you know, and it is kind of like the most monstrous thing that a kid can imagine, you know, because from a perspective and then even from an adult perspective, like adulthood's not fun, you know, so
yeah. So you know, it's funny. So I had this idea, like the original idea was just, could you adapt Beowulf for kids? Because I love this story, and then I thought excuse me, you know, there's this you know, there are elements that obviously map nicely, which is like to a kid it's very visceral to think. I mean, Beowulf is basically a story, at least sort of approximately, about we had this really good thing going and this monster ruined it. That's like the baseline story for the setup anyway. Mm-hmm. And so that's very good for a kid. But then I was like, but most of the story is like people getting killed, or at least a lot of the, you know, big moments involve people getting killed, like eaten. Like it's really horrifying. And so obviously you can't do that for little children. And then so it occurred to me that like, well, they could get turned into adults, and then that turned out to be very rich. Because one, it's just kind of funny, the idea of like a kid, like to a kid, like that is death, you know, like, and so for people who haven't read the book, the way I try to portray it is not that like adulthood is like being a monster exactly. The monstrousness is just that they're kind of like ghosts in the sense like they just care about their mortgage and the news, and they're eating plain yogurt, and it's just like, oh God, everything that was wonderful is gone from them. And so I hope that's, you know, I hope that's clear. You know, it's like I'm making fun of myself because I care about my mortgage and saving for retirement, all this horrible stuff that we have to do as adults that interferes with all the good stuff, you know. And so, but what's fun is, for me, what's fun about that is it kind of works. If I did it right, it works on two levels, which is one, it's just kind of funny, and I think the kid gets that it's an insult to the adult who's hopefully reading it with them. But then also, I mean, I think the most kind of naive reading of Beowulf, which I like to think is the correct one, of course we don't know, and there are different views of it, but is that it's basically a story about mortality or time or dying. They're kind of all the same thing, right? And so, you know, in Beowulf, it really looms, the original one, like one of the weird things in the story that we don't really do in storytelling anymore is the poet will tell you who's going to die before they die. You know, it'll be like, but he didn't know he was going to die in a minute. Hold on, which is really weird. You know, like you can't imagine that in a Superman movie, like the narrator popping in to be like, by the way, you know, the Lex Luthor's going to lose in about 4 minutes. You know, but it ties into this kind of overall tone of like everything is just sort of faded and you have to live with it and tough noogies. And so it allows, I hope, that the story to have this kind of like extra level of like, well, this is a kind of like, you know, thinking about, you know, it is kind of wonderful to be a kid. It does kind of suck to not like, I mean, every person over a certain age has had this experience of like, why is it that when I lie down to bed, I can't imagine myself into another universe like I used to be able to? Yeah. It used to be so easy. It was like an accident. I could not do it. Now I have to like focus, and I I start thinking about the stock market or like, a 401k and I just can't not. And it's horrible. Um, yeah, I know, it's just terrible. And so like kind of presenting that as like this death. And the something can I brag on my artist. I have the best artist in the world, Boulet is, and he
Mhm.
did this wonderful thing. I don't even know that this was intentional. There's a scene where Beowulf actually fights real monsters that are like trying to kill her. But what's funny is they're kind of cute. And so that kind of leaves emotional room for the like actual monster to be the adults. Like the only scenes I think that are really kind of terrifying are the ones where the adults or the monsters, they're trying to turn the kids into adults, so they won't be kids anymore.
Mm.
Yeah.
That is so true. Because I would love to talk about working with Boulay because the art is great. And, like in that opening story, there is a scene where like all the adults are hovering over the little orphan king and they're holding like, college funds and like pictures of stock trends and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's a terrifying picture. And like the art is so expressive and the adults are so menacing over this
Yeah.
little kid. Like, what was it like working with this artist and
Oh,
like
yeah.
how did the art like how did that aspect of it add to like how you imagine the story, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So you know, Boulet was my top choice. What happened? This is a sort of weird process for this. So, I wrote it out like just on a document. It's like a poem. I mean, it's just like a column of words. I had maybe I think at most 10 notes on it, like here's who's talking here, stuff like that. Nothing too detailed. So my view is just like, you know, yeah. So I sent it to him and he liked it. So we ended up working together, which is great. And my view is if you're working with someone like Boulet, who I genuinely view as good as you can be in cartooning, like the just the combination of technical skill and kind of mood setting and setting time and that stuff. I would say you might say someone is as good as him. Nobody I could think of as better. And when you have someone like that, I think you should give them as much creative room as you dare, because what happens is they come up with stuff.
Mhm.
And so, like I said, I hadn't written in that the monster should be less scary than Grindel, the adult, but like it's in there and it's just so perfect. Um, but like I'll give you an example. So I am also an illustrator. I'm capable of having illustrated this book, not as well as Gilles as Boulet, but like I'll give you an example. So there's a part at the beginning where you hear this story of the orphan kid who found all this gold and did all this stuff, and then at the end he basically dies. I mean, he doesn't literally die, but there's a funeral for his childhood, and you see him as a teenager after that. And I think if I had drawn it, I would have made him kind of gross and kind of nasty and pathetic. And Gilles made him sort of like a dapper little handsome guy, like with a little teenagery hobbledehoyness. He does have like fuzzy chin hair or whatever, but like it was very gentle in a
Mhm.
way I didn't think I would have been. And I feel like that added a kind of nice something to it. Like it wasn't just this kind of like mean mocking tone. I mean, we do that a little in the fight with the teenagers later, where it's more appropriate. But I think it also adds to the kind of like mortality aspect because it's like they've moved on to this world where they care about like their phone and what peers think of them and so. But that was all him. There was no note for me, and I think I would have done it worse, not just on technical grounds, but we've gotten the mood not as good as he did. He really gave this kind of gentleness that was very nice. Gave it some depth.
Oh, that's so cool. And I think that like it's very interesting and having worked with an artist who was, creating images based on my words, like it is
Yeah.
like the binary between like writer and artist like is not quite as clear as it probably sounds,
No.
like when they're credited differently because like oftentimes like my creative partner Sophie would like when she's doing a panel would like put in a little sight gag that I never
Yeah.
even thought of that I wouldn't have dreamt of in a million years, and I'm like that's writing too, like you're
Yeah. Yeah, it totally is. Yeah.
writing in
I
your
mean,
brain and translating it to the image, but like it's a lot more collaborative than I think
yeah.
like it might appear, when you're looking at the credits on the inside cover.
Yeah, I know. I had the exact same thought. I remember, thinking, is there something we could call him other than illustrator? Like, I think in a fair world, he would be called something like director.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Because it is more like that. Like, as a writer, I mean, so I know there's some writers who really like to be like panel 3, low angle. He says this, and that's fine. But I'm just not that. that's not my style. But also, like I said, like I'll give you the other example of something really. I actually rewrote around a change he made in one place, which was, in the original story, Grendel attacks twice. And I actually missed it, I think, the first time I'd read it, but I was reading it very carefully for this. And it's actually very moody because it really adds this level of desperation, because it's like the monster fought us when we didn't expect it and we got beat. And then we kind of got back together to fight him and then still got whooped. And then, so it's like, that's how from a story perspective that everything is hopeless. Mm-hmm. And so I put that in. And in my original version, Grendel just attacks twice, but Boulet changed it. Well, it didn't change it, but like he drew the first one as a little more sneaky, less aggressive. Mm-hmm. And so I actually rewrote around that because it was kind of cool. So now it's this kind of like horrible nightmare. Everyone's asleep and he just comes in and takes their childhoods, But then you get this nice next scene, which is all the kids prepare to fight, and then they still lose just as hard, and that's why it's so hopeless. And that was all him. I had not thought to do it that way, but I saw it and I was like, oh my God, this is so obviously better. And so I actually rewrote the words to accommodate that, to make it the original one more sneaky sounding.
Ooh, that's cool. And like, let's talk about the words, because you capture like the rhythm and the sound of the Old English text really well. And a lot of that is by the way that you use like medieval poetic techniques. It's like you use the alliteration and the compound words,
Yeah.
And what's the other one that I wanted to bring? Oh, and all the alphabets. Yes. Yeah. So can you talk about like how you used these aspects of the original medieval poetry and turned that into poetry for kids?
Yeah. So to be clear, it's not a high fidelity adaptation of medieval sounds, although in places it is. But so like basically because I think it would be almost I talk about this a little in the back matter. I think if I did it in a very strict, short clipped alliterative lines, it would be almost inscrutable to a kid. And so I did lengthen out the lines. I did compensate for that by adding, I alliterate a little more than an Old English poet would have. But yeah, I did go for capturing the sound. And the sound of Beowulf. I know that the opening in Old English goes flat, and you can hear that pounding alliterative noise. So even if you don't hear it, you hear that it sounds like chanting, and it's just wonderful. It's just wonderful to hear it. It just has a nice sound. It's very different from like reading Alexander Pope write couplets or something, which is a little more fancy, which I like too. And actually Pope drops into these alliterative tricks himself at times, but it's just a different sort of thing. And so I wanted to have that partially just because like it's cool. My view is like I believe in not talking down to kids, but I don't actually care about it that much. What I believe in is sharing with kids because I like this stuff. It's all selfish for me. I want them to be like me so we can do this together. This is objectively good stuff. And so the other elements were, in addition to the alliteration and I tried to do the other thing that Old English poetry does is there's what's called a breath gate, which is a kind of pause in the middle. Mm-hmm. So you can hear it in well, there's a famous line. I'll probably get it wrong because I don't speak Old English, but like when it describes, the line is Grendel went down bearing God's ire, but in Old English it's Grendel gong gun. There's a pause. God is eager bear, something like that, and you get that pause, and then you alliterate after it if you can, and it's just this wonderful sound. That's what gives it this like clanging sound. And so I tried really hard to duplicate that noise. The other thing I did, I have a couple other tricks I did. So I did, as you say, there are these little compound phrases. And in some places, so when in one of the games that are played in the original Beowulf are these compound phrases. So like battle adder, what does that mean? It means arrow. The famous ones are like whale road means the sea. And I put in a couple myself. Some I stole. I said shoreless sea for sky, which I believe is in the original. Mm. But I made up one. I made up sliding sea for a river, which I like because it sounds like a kid thing. So that's fun. And I found it, at least on my daughter, and this is risky because my daughter's kind of a dorkwad. So hopefully other kids are dorky enough too. But they like it because there's a kind of riddling aspect to it. And it also just sounds cool. I started calling this character who's a kind of compound of several characters in the story named Wendy, who just is always kind of defending the hall and watching out for everyone. And I referred to it as Roger's shield, Roger's the king. And a kid, that's very natural for a kid, and it's very sort of empowering sounding. Like I am his shield. Like there's no simile. I am the shield. And it's just very cool for a kid.
Yeah.
And then I found that I explained this idea to my daughter, and she started making them up for things in her life, and isn't that cute? Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So it's like, again, it's not like I had to wag my finger over it. This is just fun. And the other thing I did, which there's a couple more subtle things. One is I strictly avoided, I'm not strictly because I couldn't everywhere, but words derived from Latin or French, I tried to avoid them. There were a couple places where I just felt like I couldn't. But you want words that are like, like have a lot of consonants and just have a sort of thrust to them. Thrust is a good one, right? So like, as opposed to like, I'm not going to think of an example offhand, but like when you start coming in with like Latinate words, these multi-syllables and not a lot of consonants, I think kind of the only places you'll actually see me do it, there are a couple places where I'm speaking in adult voice where, like, for example, it says something like, strictly speaking, they were plugged into his power source or something, and then I will allow in the Latin words because it's supposed to sound bad. But yeah, I tried to keep it cute, right? So so when you use these nice words that we've had in our language for over 1,000 years, and then you mush them together, like there's a part I was very happy with where I was talking about how the kids were having a party after winning, and the phrase was something like laughter cartwheeled. That's all old English words, and it works, and you can hear it doesn't. I mean, I love French; it's a beautiful language. I speak a little bit of it, but it has a different sound. And so I tried to, it's a little hard in English because English is, like 20% French, and there's a lot of Greek and Latin in there, but you can avoid those words, and it gives this kind of meaty sound,
Yes.
Which I think is nice.
That is so cool. Like I really love the way that language is used here, and I think it's just going to be very interesting for kids to read too. Before we wrap up, let's talk a little bit about Bea herself, because you mentioned your daughter, and I know that your daughter is wrapped up in reasons why you have chosen a female protagonist. So can you talk a little bit about where she came from?
Yeah, sure. It helps that Bea is the right name. But honestly, I feel like in this book I didn't think about it too hard. But what I did try to do is that Beowulf has kind of like typically feminine emblems on her, but they're kind of, what I try to do is that's part of the show. That's like not a kind of like I overcame this. It's none of that. It's just kind of like the way kids do. They just wear what they want to wear and they do what they want to do, and it's just who she is. So it's funny, back when I did Augie and the Greek Knight, it felt like it was a little bit of a novelty to put a kind of like risk-taking girl on an adventure in a story, and now I think that's actually not as big a deal anymore. Like my daughter reads endless Ursula Vernon, which all there's a lot of really good young female lead stories. When I say good, I mean that it's like taking risks and not being Hermione Granger. Not that everybody, somebody's got to be Hermione Granger, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And just it's a really great time for kids literature, actually. And so I remember thinking about it much more consciously with that book, and this one I was just kind of like a little, I guess, more focused on the story. Excuse me, but I do like having that for my daughter. And I remember seeing, I forget what they do in the original book, but I stole a phrase from Beowulf and modified it. And the phrase in my book is something like, she had the strength of 60 kids in each hand. And I remember telling my daughter that, and she just ate it up. She was like literally balling her fists, like, yes. So there is this kind of empowering quality to it. But like I said, I had more theory about it with the last book, and I actually think the environment has just gotten so much better. I'm sure you've noticed that, like in the last 10 years, it's so much easier to find really good stuff.
Oh gosh, absolutely. And like in general, I think for girls and children's lit, there's been a really interesting arc, because like in the 80s, like there was a lot more like gender neutral stuff than there is currently.
Yeah.
Like Legos weren't marketed to like boys and girls differently, stuff like that. And then I guess in the era of like a lot of like toy advertising, things got like super gendered for a while, like really girly toys and really boyish toys. But like that divide is kind of breaking down again. And so like Bea is so great because she she is like a throwback, I think, to those 80s kids too, you know, like who were just like feral in the woods, you know, and like not super concerned about like gender or like,
Yeah.
you know, like how they, you know, how they thought others perceived them, you know, so, and that's really great too, I think.
Yeah, I have something that really flipped my switch on this years ago was I'd done, I can't remember what comic I did, but it was something like talking about this stuff. And I remember I had a woman wrote me kind of half complaining, half just talking. And she said, you know, that she didn't like a tendency in literature to kind of denigrate girly stuff. She was like, I'm a mathematician and I like girly stuff, and that's fine. And I was like, that's fine. You're right. That's good. That's a very good point. And so I tried to ever since be like, there's this tendency to always want to put the like girls in pants and make sure they can't have any sort of like prototypically girly stuff. And I feel like as long as you know, there's a fine line, I guess, but it was just kind of like, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Because being a girl in that period, you know, like you didn't pick things because they were girlish or boyish, you know, you
Right.
picked things because they were cool, you know, and
They're
so
awesome. Yeah.
you go out in like a tutu and combat boots, you know, and that's like absolutely a valid choice.
Yeah, and Boulay is super into that because one of my favorite things about his art, you look at every single background character, they look like they're up to something. There's no generic kids in this story, even kids who don't talk. They're only there for a panel. And it's that thing you're talking. And he was talking about. He's really into this thing kids do. My daughter still does this. She's starting to get out of it, which is terrible. But that, like, yeah, I am going to wear a tutu and a Viking helmet. And there's no kind of like I'm doing something funny. It's just like everything is good, and together it is cumulative. And there's there's no sense that one thing might detract from another. It's all great when you're a kid, you know.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And do you think that you'll ever return to medieval literature as a source for your stories?
Yeah, well, it's it depends on sales. So like as you might imagine, it's you don't always you don't just get to write a 600 line unrhymed poem for children. But actually we're doing better than we expected on this book in terms of people wanting to talk about it and buy it for libraries and stuff. So my hope, so this story takes you up through the fight with the monster, which is in the original about 40% of the story. So I would if this does well, I'd love to finish the whole thing out. And then as you say, there are a bunch of other stories. I mean, I think Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf are maybe the very best, but there's so much good stuff and moody stuff, and yeah, I would love to. I would love to. So I would love to go to it over and over and over if the public will let me get away with it. That's the open question.
Amazing. Well, I will, be sure to proselytize it to medieval Twitter and all of the medievalists in my circle. Thank you so much for writing it and for coming to talk to us about it. Like, I've had a great time talking to you, and I really hope everybody goes out and gets this, and we get to hear much more about Bea's adventures and other medievalist kids.
Yes, I hope so. Thank you very much.
No problem. All right, listeners. So as of the airing of this episode, you will be able to pick up Bea Wolf at your nearest independent bookstore or comic book store or library, wherever you end up that day. Thank you for joining us. This has been Jenn in conversation with Zach Weinersmith, and it is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.